Introduction Part 2. Section 4. Classification of the faculties. As there are some who doubt whether the mind can be represented as having faculties, or at least separate faculties, it will be necessary to lay down some explanations and limitations. 1. The mind evidently possesses power. Matter itself possesses power. It is acknowledged to have properties, and what are properties but powers? It has, for example, a gravitating, a chemical, and electronic power. Physical science is seeking to determine the precise law, rule, and expression of the powers of body. If matter has power, much more has mind. The powers of mind are different from those of matter. If the one has attractive and magnetic powers, the other has powers of understanding and emotion. The mind has powers, but not all possible or conceivable powers. Its powers are bounded. Thus we cannot tell what is doing at this moment in the planet Venus or the constellation Orion. Just as physics would determine the precise rule and limit of gravitation or chemical affinity, so psychology should try to ascertain and express the precise laws of such powers as the memory, the imagination, and the conscience. 2. That there are different powers in the mind is evident from differences in the mental states and affections of different persons. This conclusion might be drawn from the very differences between man and a brute. The lower animals possess powers common to them and human beings, but there are others, such as the discernment of moral obligation, which are peculiar to men. But the inference can be drawn more directly from the circumstance that one man is distinguished for powers which are either not possessed by other men, or possessed only in an inferior degree. Thus, one man has a great tendency to observe causes, another resemblances. One has keen emotional sensibility, ever ready to flow out, another resolute will. It has further to be noticed, as decisive of the whole question, that these capacities and inclinations may become hereditary and go down from father or mother to son or daughter. This is further evident from the circumstance that we are not always exercising every faculty or the same faculties. In every given state of mind, there seem to be more than one power in exercise. But all the mental powers are not in action, or at least in intense action every instant. At this moment, I may be looking at the paper before me and at the same time collecting my thoughts to write this paragraph. Immediately after, I may be looking at the same paper, but my mind may have wandered off to some imaginary scene in which I and my friends are figuring. From such a case we see that memory is different from imagination, for I was remembering when I was not exercising imagination, and imagining when I was not remembering. It is evident, too, that both memory and imagination are different from sense, for we had the senses in the one case without memory, and in the other without imagination. Some would say that what are spoken of in these articles are not different faculties, but different modes of consciousness. I am not sure that this is an improved statement or the correct statement. Our perceptions, recollections, judgments are not modes of consciousness. The accurate account is that self-consciousness observes them, and they must exist in order to their being noticed. But even though they were modes of consciousness, the questions would immediately arise. what are these different modes? And in answering, we would be brought back to different powers leading to the diverse manifestations of consciousness. 4. The faculties are powers of one indivisible mind. They do not differ from each other as the hand does from the foot, or the lungs from the heart. They are powers of one existence, possessing a variety of attributes. The faculties are not to be regarded as necessarily operating one after another in regular order or at different times. The properties of matter often act simultaneously. At the same time that the iron is chemically combining with oxygen to form rust, it is attracted to the earth by gravitation, and yet we regard the gravitating and chemical powers as different. On a like principle, we are constrained to regard the capacity of sense perception when the object is present as different from the memory when it is absent. It seems clear that several of the mental powers may be blended in one act. Thus, at the same time that I am judging or deciding, I may be under the influence of hope or fear or benevolence or prejudice. How many diverse powers may be exercised at one and the same time in that blade of grass or in our finger, the gravitating, chemical, electric, vital, no one can tell how many. There may be a like number and diversity of powers at work in certain of the exercises of the mind, as when men are solving perplexing problems, speculative or practical, or rising to the higher flights of genius. 6. It is difficult to form a classification of the faculties which deserves to be regarded as complete. This arises from a variety of causes. It may proceed from human incapacity, from the difficulty of penetrating phenomena which are so fugitive, that is, so briefly under the view, and so complicated, and from the circumstances that the faculties very much run into each other. This is a hindrance not peculiar to psychology. How difficult do botanists find it to draw out an arrangement of the vegetable kingdom which may include all and exclude none, which may combine the like and separate the unlike. Yet they do contrive to draw out such a classification as is fitted to bring into view the sameness and difference of plants. We may in like manner so distribute the operations of the mind as to unfold their characteristics and their distinctions. 7. There may be a classification of the faculties embodying much truth and of eminent practical utility, though not professing to be perfect. It is true that the mind is one, but it manifests itself in a variety of ways, and its characteristic operations must be carefully noted and their peculiarities unfolded. It is only when the acts are marked, distinguished, classified, and named that we can be said to have any adequate idea of the nature of the mind. For practical ends, for the purposes of the orator, the poet, the advocate at the bar, and the preacher in the pulpit, even the ordinary letter writing and conversation, there must be distinctions of some kind drawn, as between the head and the heart, between the imagination and the judgment, between the understanding and the will. It is the business of the psychologist to seize upon real distinctions and unfold them as accurately as possible, and in this he cannot err to any extent, provided he follow a careful observation and be ready to confess that while he exhibits the truth, it is not the whole truth, and that however much we know, there is always more to men unknown. 8. In proceeding to distribute the powers, it is first of all desirable to have some such division as that which we have of the physical world into the mineral, the vegetable, and the animal kingdom. The Eleatic school, 500 BC, had a loose division of what we now call the intellectual powers into sense perception, probable opinion, doxa, and reason, logos. Plato had a like threefold division, and had a further division of what is now called the motive powers into sensual feelings, impulse, and love. Aristotle gave a better division into the noetic or gnostic, translated cognitive, and the oractive, translated appetent or motive. This twofold division reappears in the distinction between the understanding and the will, the intellectual and active powers, and popularly the head and the heart. Of a later date, some have felt it necessary to draw distinctions of the important kind between the various powers embraced in the will or heart, and this led to a threefold division: the cognitive, the feelings, and the will, a classification adopted by Kant and Hamilton. In this division, the senses must be included under either the cognitive or the feelings, or divided between them. To avoid this awkwardness, there is a fourfold distribution: the senses, the intellect, the feelings, and the will. It should be observed that in this distribution, the conscious of moral faculty has no place, and those who have carefully noted its operations will acknowledge how difficult it is to bring it, with its peculiar ideas of right, wrong, and duty, under any of the heads named. To avoid these and other difficulties, the following, embracing all the others, is submitted as a good provisional division, fitted to expose to view the leading attributes of the mind. N.B. It should be noticed, first, the conscience, which is both a cognitive and a motive power, has the attributes of both the two heads. Second, the compositive power of imagination can be called a cognitive power only with the explanation that it is cognitive not as it knows existing objects, but inasmuch as its ideas are reproductions of cognitions. Section 5. Education of the faculties. It is often said that education should proceed philosophically. But there is no agreement among those who hold this view as to what philosophy is, some preferring the Scottish, others the Hegelian, and a number of the present day the sensational or materialistic philosophy. It is more correct and definite to say that education should proceed psychologically, and when it does, so it proceeds philosophically. But what does this mean? It may mean two things somewhat different and yet connected and both important. It may mean that we educate the faculties. This should be one of the aims, one of the main aims of education. Our faculties are in the first instance mere capacities, with a tendency to act. They are in infants in the form of a seed, or germ, or norm, and need to be cherished in order to grow and to be useful. They are all capable of being trained and should be trained, and education, private and public, should undertake the work. But the statements that education should proceed psychologically may mean something more. It may signify that education should proceed according to the genesis and natural growth of the powers. It implies that we begin with the lower and go on to the higher powers. Our psychology, if properly constructed, may greatly aid the science of education. It shows us what the faculties are, what their laws and modes of operation, and it is by knowing these that we are able to train them. It should show us what powers first appear, and how one power grows out of another, and thus lead us to discover what branches should be taught, and in what order, what should be taught to children, and what to those further advanced. For special purposes, scientific, professional, or practical, greater pains may be taken with some of these powers than with others, but at the same time all should be so far cultivated as to keep the mind properly balanced, and to prevent it from being one-sided, exclusive, partial, and prejudiced. Now, these topics may legitimately be taken up in a work on psychology, at least in an incidental way as we proceed. End of section 2.